the city never truly slept. Chicago's downtown streets glowed with restless energy, the neon buzz of convenience stores, the constant hum of traffic, the chatter of people spilling out of late-night diners. Steam rose from subway grates, blurring the edges of the sidewalks like a veil. It was winter, the kind of winter that gnawed at bones. Snow hadn't yet fallen, but the air cut sharp, and the wind sliced through even the thickest coats. Among the crowd, people hurried home, nurses just off the night shift, delivery drivers pulling up their jackets, young couples laughing as they rushed across crosswalks. Everyone had somewhere to be. Everyone belonged somewhere. Everyone except David Miller. David sat on a splintered wooden bench near the corner of State and Madison, not far from a 24-hour Walgreens. His jacket, once brown, now dulled into an indistinguishable gray, hung loose on his shoulders, the zipper broken. A knitted beanie, stretched from years of wear, covered part of his thinning hair. His boots, soles half-detached, revealed glimpses of worn socks beneath. His fingers clutched a crumpled paper bag close to his chest like it was treasure. Inside, one small piece of bread he had saved from the church shelter's dinner line. It wasn't enough to fill him. But hunger was a constant companion now, so constant that his body had stopped roaring with it. It just ached quietly, gnawing in the background like a dull knife. The city moved around him like he didn't exist. A man in a tailored navy suit passed by, checking his Rolex as he spoke into his Bluetooth. A group of college students, laughing too loudly, crossed the street, carrying boxes of leftover pizza. A mother tugged her child's hand a little tighter when they walked near David, whispering under her breath. David had grown used to it. The looks, the quick averted eyes, the subtle way people angled their bodies to avoid brushing against him. He was invisible, and at the same time, too visible. Both felt like a curse. He leaned back on the bench, the wooden slats cold against his spine. The city skyline stretched upward, glittering with promise, towers of steel and glass that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Once, years ago, he had built structures like those. Not skyscrapers, but mid-rise apartment blocks, suburban homes, schools. His hands had been steady, his back strong. He used to come home with calluses and dust, greeted by the smell of dinner cooking, his son's little feet running across the living room floor. But that was before. Before the fall. His thumb rubbed against the folded paper bag. He thought about saving the bread for tomorrow. You never knew when you'd get another meal. But tomorrow felt so far away. Tonight was the only thing that was certain. As he sat there, a memory crept in, one he didn't want but couldn't stop. The sound of his wife's laughter, the warm light of their kitchen, the clink of cutlery on plates. He saw his boy at the table, cheeks flushed from running outside, asking if Dad would take him fishing that weekend. He could almost feel the warmth of that old house, the steady heartbeat of a family. He blinked, and it was gone. Replaced with the cold, the dark, and the endless drone of traffic. A group of teenagers walked past, one of them tossing a half-empty soda cup into the trash can near his bench. The sweet smell of it lingered, taunting him. He closed his eyes. The truth was, David hadn't ended up here overnight. The world imagined homelessness as sudden, but for him, it was a slow erosion. A back injury on the construction site that left him unable to work long hours. Medical bills stacked high, insurance refusing coverage. He tried desk jobs, but the economy swallowed opportunities faster than he could chase them. His wife, tired of holding everything together, eventually left. She took their son with her. He told himself he didn't blame her. But at night, when the streets grew too quiet, he felt the hole she left like an open wound. The wind picked up, forcing him to tuck the paper bag closer. His stomach twisted again, reminding him of the single piece of bread. Maybe he should eat it now. Just a small bite, enough to quiet the ache. He loosened the bag, staring at it like it carried the weight of the world. But before he could take a bite, a faint sound reached his ears. A voice. Small, fragile. "Excuse me, sir." David turned his head slowly. Standing a few feet away was a little girl, no older than 8. Her coat was too thin for the night, its zipper missing. Her mittens had holes in the fingertips. Her blonde hair was tangled, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She shifted nervously, her eyes darting to the bag in his hands. He stiffened. He wasn't used to children speaking to him. Most parents kept them far away. She swallowed hard, her voice cracking. "I haven't eaten since yesterday." For a moment, the city noise dimmed. David's eyes fell to the bread in his hands, then back to the child's wide, pleading gaze. Hunger twisted inside him. His throat felt dry. Every instinct screamed to hold on to the bread, the one bit of comfort he had, the only thing that stood between him and the emptiness of the night. His fingers trembled. Slowly, painfully, he opened the bag and pulled the bread out. It was stale, but it was something. He stared at it for what felt like an eternity. Then, without a word, he broke it in half. His hands shook as he pressed the larger piece into the girl's mittened hands. Her eyes lit up with relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice fragile but bursting with sincerity. She clutched the bread and ran toward the shadow of a bus stop, where a woman sat slumped against the glass, the girl's mother, pale and tired, wrapped in a thin blanket. David sat frozen, the smaller piece of bread still in his hand. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. His stomach cried for food, but for the first time in a long time, something else filled the hollow inside him. Something warm. Something human. He looked down at the bread he had left, barely enough for one bite, and smiled faintly through cracked lips. The city kept moving around him, unaware. But for David, the night had shifted. The night was merciless. Wind howled through the narrow streets, rattling loose shutters and bending the trees until they groaned. Rain came down in sheets, soaking the cracked sidewalks, filling potholes, and turning alleys into shallow rivers. David walked slowly, clutching the loaf of bread tighter to his chest. The paper bag had already grown soft from the storm, the crust of the bread peeking through the edges, vulnerable to the downpour. His coat, once brown, now hung heavy and dark with water. His shoes squelched with every step, and each gust of wind cut through him like a blade. He was used to storms, both the kind outside and the kind inside his heart. But this one felt different. Maybe it was the loneliness. Maybe it was the memory of Emily that pressed hard against his chest every time thunder rolled. Or maybe it was the sense that tonight, his life was about to change. The boy in the shadows. As David turned a corner near the old park, his eyes caught a small figure huddled beneath a bench. At first, he thought it was a stray dog, curled tightly against the cold. But then lightning split the sky, and he saw the outline of thin arms wrapped around thin knees. It was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 12. His hair was plastered to his forehead, dripping rain into eyes that darted nervously at every sound. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his frail body, his backpack pressed tightly against his chest as if it contained his entire world. David slowed his steps, his heart twisting. He remembered what it felt like to be unseen, a shadow among the living. "Hey," David called softly, not wanting to startle him. His voice was raspy from the cold and years of silence. The boy flinched, pulling his backpack closer, as though bracing for someone to take it from him. His lips trembled, not just from the chill, but from fear. "I'm not going to hurt you," David added gently, stopping a few feet away. The storm raged between them, but for a moment, it felt like time held still. A silent exchange. The boy didn't answer. His eyes, wide and cautious, flicked to the loaf of bread David carried. Hunger lived in that stare, raw, desperate, undeniable. David followed the boy's gaze. Slowly, he looked down at the bread in his hands, then back at the child. His stomach growled angrily at the thought. This was supposed to be his only meal for the next day, maybe longer. Without it, he had nothing. But the boy, he looked like he had even less. For a long moment, David's mind wrestled with itself. His own survival, his own pain, versus the boy's empty eyes. Rain drummed against the pavement, demanding a decision. Finally, with trembling fingers, David knelt and tore the loaf in half. He extended one piece toward the boy. "Here," he said quietly. "Take it." The first bite the boy hesitated, as if expecting it to be a trick. His small hands shook as he slowly reached out and accepted the bread. For a second, he stared at it, rain dripping from his lashes. Then, with a sudden burst of hunger, he bit into it, chewing quickly, almost desperately. David watched, his own stomach aching with emptiness. Yet, as he saw the boy eat, something stirred in him. Something he thought had died with Emily. It was hope. When the boy had finished half the piece, he stopped and looked at David. His voice was barely a whisper, carried away almost instantly by the storm. Why did you give this to me?" David swallowed hard. He didn't have a simple answer. Maybe because he saw himself in the boy. Maybe because Emily would have wanted him to. Maybe because, for the first time in years, he realized he still had something worth giving. "Because you needed it more than I did," David finally replied. The boy's eyes softened, a flicker of trust breaking through the fear. A shared shelter lightning cracked again, and the boy shivered violently. Without thinking, David removed his own damp coat and placed it over the boy's shoulders. The boy protested weakly, "But you'll be cold." David smiled faintly, though his lips trembled. "I've been cold before. I'll survive." Together, they sat under the bench as rain continued to pour around them. It wasn't much of a shelter, but in that moment, it felt like a sanctuary. For the first time in years, David wasn't alone. The breaking of silence after a long silence, the boy finally spoke again, his voice fragile. "My name's Ethan." David nodded slowly. "David." Ethan clutched his backpack. "My mom, she left a few months ago. Said she'd come back. She never did." His words trembled. "I've been trying to make it on my own." David felt a lump in his throat. He had known abandonment too, though in a different form. He reached out gently, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You don't have to do it alone anymore." Ethan looked up at him, eyes searching, weighing whether to believe those words. And in the middle of that storm, something unspoken passed between them, a fragile thread of connection, spun from hunger, kindness, and shared pain. A turning point as dawn began to break, the storm finally eased. The clouds parted slowly, revealing streaks of pale pink across the horizon. The city, drenched and battered, began to stir awake. David and Ethan emerged from under the bench, shivering but alive. David held out the remaining piece of bread. "Let's share this for breakfast," he said softly. Ethan hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Okay." They broke the bread together, sitting side by side as the first light of morning warmed their faces. For David, it was the first meal in years that didn't taste of loneliness. Closing of the section that night, that storm, marked the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted. A stranger and a child, bound together by a single act of compassion. David had given away his bread, not knowing he was receiving something far greater in return: purpose, family, and a second chance at life. And Ethan, for the first time in a long time, believed that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't forgotten after all. The traffic light turned red at the corner of State and Madison. Inside a black Lexus SUV, Sarah Thompson gripped the steering wheel, her manicured nails tapping impatiently. The heater hummed, wrapping her in a cocoon of warmth. Outside, the world looked harsh: icy sidewalks, weary faces rushing past. She had just left another extravagant corporate party she'd organized, a holiday gala filled with chandeliers, champagne glasses clinking, and people in gowns that cost more than a month's rent. Her business card read, "Event planner to the elite." And she was good at it. The kind of good that made her clients trust her with million-dollar weddings and high-profile charity balls. On paper, Sarah had it all: success, a beautiful two-story colonial-style home in Naperville, a teenage son in private school. But as she sat there waiting for the light to change, the inside of her chest felt as hollow as the winter air outside. She glanced in her rear-view mirror, and froze. Just behind her SUV, across the street, she caught sight of something unusual. A man, homeless by every sign of it, sat on a bench, his shoulders hunched against the cold. But it wasn't him that caught her breath. It was what he was doing. A little girl had approached him, her thin arms trembling, her eyes wide with hunger. And Sarah watched as the man pulled something from a crumpled bag. Bread. He stared at it, his hands shaking as if the decision cost him everything. Then, slowly, he broke it in half, giving the larger piece to the child. Sarah's throat tightened. She had seen countless homeless people in Chicago. She often dropped spare change into charity buckets or signed checks at fundraisers for homeless awareness. But those were abstractions, safe gestures. What she saw now wasn't abstract. It was raw. A man who had nothing, still choosing to give away the only food he had left. The SUV behind her honked. The light had turned green. But Sarah didn't move right away. Her eyes lingered on the scene, the girl running back to her mother at the bus stop, the homeless man sitting quietly with his smaller piece of bread, staring into the night as if no one had noticed. Finally, she pressed the gas pedal. The Lexus rolled forward, but her mind didn't. It stayed locked on the image. Sarah drove in silence, her thoughts louder than the hum of the engine. How long had it been since she felt something real? Her house in Naperville was a picture-perfect slice of American suburbia, trimmed hedges, brick pathway, white shutters. Yet when she walked inside each night, the silence pressed in. Her teenage son, Ryan, barely spoke to her anymore, headphones always on, buried in video games or scrolling on his phone. And the divorce, well, that was still a wound she covered with makeup and polite smiles at business lunches. Her ex-husband lived in California now, with a younger woman and a new family. She parked in her driveway, the house dark except for the porch light. The neighborhood was quiet, every house lined neatly in rows, each one glowing with Christmas decorations. Wreaths, string lights, inflatable Santas. Her neighbors lived lives that seemed whole, while hers felt like an expensive but empty box. Sarah entered the kitchen and set her purse down. On the marble counter, she noticed the remnants of Ryan's dinner, a pizza box, half-eaten slices left behind. He hadn't even bothered to put them in the fridge. She stared at the greasy cardboard, the casual waste of food, and thought of the man's trembling hands, the girl's grateful eyes. Her own stomach churned, not from hunger but from something else: guilt, shame, longing. Later that night, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, still in her work dress, scrolling mindlessly on her phone. Instagram feeds of friends on vacations, influencers smiling in perfectly lit kitchens, ads for luxury cars and skincare. None of it touched her. Her mind replayed the scene over and over: the bread, the sacrifice, the invisible nobility of a man the world had written off. For years, Sarah had equated success with things she could measure: money in the bank, clients who praised her, the comfort of her suburban bubble. But that single moment at the traffic light had pierced straight through the armor she had built. She whispered into the silence of her bedroom, "Why did that move me so much?" No answer came. Only the echo of her own emptiness. The next morning, Sarah met her father for breakfast at a diner, the kind with red vinyl booths and endless coffee refills. Her father, Richard Thompson, was a retired businessman in his early 70s. Gray hair neatly combed, gold watch gleaming, he embodied a lifetime of success built on discipline and pride. He ordered black coffee and eggs over easy, lecturing Sarah about her work schedule, about how she should focus on expanding her business instead of soft distractions. But Sarah's mind drifted. She thought of the man on the bench. The way he had looked at the bread like it was gold. The way he had given it away without hesitation. "Dad," she said suddenly, cutting into his monologue, "do you ever think about people on the streets? Like, really think about them?" Richard frowned. "Sarah, don't waste your emotions. Most of them are addicts or made bad choices. You've worked hard. Don't let guilt make you foolish." Sarah stirred her coffee, her jaw tightening. For the first time, his words didn't sit right with her. She wasn't sure if they ever had. That night, as she drove home from work again, Sarah slowed at the same intersection. Her eyes searched almost instinctively for the man on the bench. And there he was. Same spot. Same jacket. Same invisible presence to the rushing world. But to Sarah, he wasn't invisible anymore. She couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. That maybe, just maybe, she had been meant to see him. As the light turned green, Sarah's heart pounded. She didn't press the gas this time. Instead, she whispered to herself, "I need to know his story." Morning sunlight spilled through the stained glass windows of a church shelter on the south side of Chicago. Rows of metal cots lined the room, each covered in thin gray blankets. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and yesterday's soup. David stirred awake, coughing lightly as the cold air pricked his lungs. Around him, men shuffled quietly, some packing up their meager belongings into plastic bags, others heading toward the coffee urn in the corner. The volunteers had already begun cleaning up, preparing for the day's outreach programs. David sat up, rubbing his stiff neck. Another night survived. Another morning to face. He pulled on his boots, the leather cracked and stiff, and stepped outside into the wind. The city roared with its usual indifference, buses grumbled down the streets, office workers hurried past with lattes in hand, children with bright backpacks clung to their parents. He tightened his jacket around himself and began the familiar walk. His goal today was the same as every day: find work. Any work. By mid-morning, David stood in front of a construction site. The clamor of hammers and drills echoed through the steel framework rising high into the sky. He watched with a pang of longing. This had once been his world. A foreman in a hard hat eyed him suspiciously as David approached. "Looking for work?" David asked, voice hoarse but steady. The man's eyes traveled over David's clothes, his weathered face, the smell of unwashed nights clinging faintly to him. "Sorry, buddy. We're full." David persisted. "I've got experience. 20 years in construction. Drywall, roofing, concrete. You name it." The foreman sighed, impatient. "You need papers, references. And, look, this isn't the place for you. Try the temp agency." The word stung more than the rejection itself. David knew what the man really meant: you don't look the part. You don't belong here anymore. He nodded stiffly and stepped away, shoulders heavy. Meanwhile, across town in a gleaming office building, Sarah Thompson sat in her glass-walled workspace. Her calendar buzzed with back-to-back appointments, venue meetings, vendor calls, high-budget wedding consultations. Yet as she stared at her laptop, her focus kept slipping. She could still see him. The man on the bench. The bread in his hands. A knock on the door broke her reverie. Her assistant popped in with a folder. "Here are the final invoices for the Anderson Gala." Sarah nodded absently. "Thanks, Jessica." The assistant hesitated. "You okay? You seem distracted." Sarah forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't fine. She hadn't been for a long time. That evening, Sarah drove to her father's sprawling suburban home. The mansion-style house gleamed with polished stone and manicured lawns. Inside, Richard Thompson sat in his leather chair, sipping scotch as a fire crackled in the hearth. "You look tired," he remarked as she entered. "Work's been busy," Sarah said, hanging her coat. Richard poured her a drink and handed it to her. "That's good. Busy means money. And money keeps the world turning." Sarah sat across from him, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. For a moment, she debated saying nothing. But the image gnawed at her too much. "Dad, have you ever seen someone who has nothing, and yet they still give?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "Where's this coming from?" "I saw a homeless man last night. He gave his only food to a child who was hungry. He didn't hesitate. He just gave." Richard scoffed. "Sarah, don't romanticize it. Those people put themselves there. Drugs, laziness, bad decisions. If you want to help, write a check to a shelter and move on. Don't let their drama weigh on you." Sarah frowned. "But what if it's not just about bad choices? What if life pushed him there? What if he used to be, like us?" Richard's jaw tightened. "We built our lives by working hard. Your grandfather dug ditches to put me through college. I didn't waste time feeling sorry for others. Compassion is fine, but too much of it makes you weak." The words landed heavily. Sarah stared into the fire, her father's reflection flickering in the flames. She wanted to argue, to scream that he was wrong, but the voice inside her hesitated. Her father had always been her measure of strength. Could he really be wrong? Back downtown, David wandered into a community center, lured by a flyer promising day labor opportunities. Inside, a tired woman at the front desk looked him over. "We've got a few landscaping jobs. Pays by the hour. But you'll need steel-toed boots, gloves, basic gear." David's heart sank. He didn't have those anymore. "I'll come back," he murmured, stepping away. He sat in the lobby for a moment, watching as a group of kids laughed in the recreation room. The center's walls were painted with murals of hope, bright colors, smiling faces, words like community, resilience, future. For a fleeting second, David remembered building playgrounds just like that, hammering nails while kids waited excitedly for the ribbon cutting. He had built futures once. Now he couldn't even build his own tomorrow. As the day ended, the city skyline glowed orange against the setting sun. Sarah sat in her car, staring at her reflection in the windshield. Her father's voice echoed in her head, "Compassion makes you weak." But her heart whispered differently. She thought of the man's face, lined with hardship yet lit with quiet strength. He had nothing, and still chose kindness. Sarah tightened her grip on the steering wheel. The winds were changing inside her. For the first time in years, she felt pulled towards something that wasn't business, wasn't money, wasn't about appearances. It was about humanity. And she couldn't ignore it any longer. The soup kitchen buzzed with the warmth of human need. The clatter of trays, the smell of tomato soup and stale bread, the hum of volunteers moving quickly, it was a place of survival wrapped in community. Fluorescent lights flickered above long folding tables where men and women huddled, some eating in silence, others chatting in low voices. David stood in line, hands shoved deep into his pockets. Hunger gnawed at him, sharper than usual. He hadn't eaten since the half-piece of bread 2 nights ago. His eyes followed the tray of the man in front of him, a ladle of soup, a scoop of mashed potatoes, 1 slice of cornbread. It wasn't much, but tonight it felt like salvation. As the line moved forward, David felt eyes on him. At first, he ignored it, he was used to stares. But this one lingered. Warm. Curious. When he finally sat with his tray, his eyes scanned the room, and there she was. Sarah. She had walked in quietly, dressed simply in jeans and a wool coat, far less polished than the version of herself that usually walked suburban streets and corporate halls. She wasn't here for charity publicity. She wasn't holding a clipboard or camera crew. She was just watching. Watching him. David shifted uncomfortably, spoon hovering over his soup. Pride tightened his chest. He hated being seen like this, reduced to a man waiting in line for a free meal. He hated the thought that she might feel pity. But then she approached. "Hi," she said softly, standing beside his table. Her voice carried a mixture of caution and sincerity. David looked up, wary. "Do I know you?" She shook her head gently. "Not yet. But I saw you the other night. Outside. With the little girl." David's spoon clinked against the bowl. His jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have been watching." "I didn't mean to intrude," Sarah said quickly. "I was in my car. But I couldn't stop thinking about what you did. You gave her your food when you had nothing." He looked away, shame flickering in his eyes. "Don't make it sound noble. I was just there." Sarah pulled out the chair across from him. "May I?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Your seat, your choice." She sat, folding her hands on the table. For a moment, neither spoke. Around them, the noise of the soup kitchen swirled, clattering trays, murmured conversations, the occasional laugh. Finally, Sarah leaned forward. "I want to buy you dinner. A real dinner. Not this." David stiffened. His pride flared like a wound touched too soon. "I'm not a charity case." Her voice stayed calm, steady. "I didn't say you were. I'd like to share a meal with you. Somewhere warm. No expectations." David studied her face, clean, kind, determined. She wasn't mocking him. She wasn't pitying. She was sincere. But sincerity was dangerous. Sincerity had burned him before. "I can't let you do that," he muttered. "Why not?" "Because it's easier to take from strangers when you don't have to see their eyes." He stared down at his soup. "When you don't have to wonder what they're thinking of you." Sarah's heart ached at his words. "I'm not thinking anything except that you deserve more than this table and this tray." Silence stretched. Then David exhaled slowly. His stomach growled, betraying him. "Fine. One meal. But that's it." Later that evening, they sat in a small diner a few blocks away, the kind with leather booths and neon signs buzzing faintly. The waitress poured coffee into thick ceramic mugs, the steam curling into the air. David sat stiffly, shoulders hunched, as though waiting for judgment. Sarah watched him gently, choosing her words carefully. "So," she began, "how long have you been out here?" He chuckled bitterly. "Long enough to know the alleys better than I know myself." She waited. He sipped his coffee, wincing at the heat, then set it down. "I used to build houses. Schools. Put up drywall, pour concrete, frame beams. 20 years of hard work. Then one injury, and suddenly I was the guy who couldn't keep up. Bills piled up, insurance played games, jobs dried up. My wife, she tried. But it was too much. One day she packed her bags. Took my boy. That was the last time I saw them." Sarah's chest tightened. "I'm so sorry." He shrugged, but the weight of the memory bent his shoulders. "I told myself I didn't blame her. But some nights. I wonder if she ever tells our son about me. Or if I'm just a ghost she erased." The diner lights hummed softly above them. Sarah's throat burned with emotion. She wanted to reach across the table, to bridge the invisible chasm between them, but she stayed still, afraid of pushing him away. You still carry yourself like a man who matters, she whispered. David's eyes flicked up, surprised. What do you mean? I mean, you gave away your last piece of bread. To a child you didn't know. That's not weakness. That's strength. The kind of strength most people with money and comfort don't even understand. For the first time, a crack appeared in his hardened expression. His lips pressed into a thin line, eyes glassy with something he didn't want to name. You talk like the world's kinder than it is, he muttered. And maybe, Sarah replied softly, the world becomes kinder when people like you still exist in it. They ate in quiet for a while. David devoured his burger slowly, as though savoring every bite. Sarah barely touched her salad, too busy watching the way his hands trembled slightly, the way his eyes softened when he forgot to guard himself. Finally, he set down his fork. Why me? Why stop your car that night? Why sit here with me now? Sarah thought for a moment. Then she said simply, because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That even when life strips everything away, kindness can still survive. David's breath caught. He looked away quickly, blinking hard. The waitress refilled their mugs, oblivious to the silent storm brewing at that booth. As they left the diner, the cold air bit at their cheeks. Sarah turned to him. I don't know what you'll decide for tomorrow, or the day after. But if you'll let me, I'd like to see you again. David hesitated, torn between pride and the flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, hope. Finally, he nodded once. Maybe. Sarah smiled gently. Then maybe is enough. They parted ways under the glow of a streetlight, the city alive around them. But for both, something had shifted. The encounter wasn't just chance. It was the beginning of change. The night after the diner, David lay awake on a thin mattress in the corner of a shelter. The building smelled faintly of bleach and sweat. Snoring echoed from other cots, the restless shifting of strangers filling the darkness. Yet sleep refused to come. Sarah's words haunted him. You still carry yourself like a man who matters. No one had spoken to him like that in years. The world had labeled him invisible, a failure, a burden. But her voice had carried no pity, only truth. Truth he wanted to believe, but couldn't. As he turned onto his back, the ceiling above blurred. His mind drifted, unwillingly, into memories. He was back in his workshop, the scent of sawdust thick in the air. His son, maybe 8 years old at the time, stood on tiptoes beside him, gripping a small hammer too big for his little hands. Like this, Dad? The boy had asked, eyes wide, eager to impress. David had laughed then, steadying the boy's hands. Not so hard. Let the hammer do the work. Gentle, but firm. You've got it. The nail slid into the wood, crooked but proud. His boy had beamed as though he'd built a castle. That smile, it cut through David's heart now like a blade. Where was that boy? Did he remember his father's hands guiding his own? Or had time erased those moments, leaving only bitterness in their place? The memory shifted again. His wife, Emily. She stood in their small kitchen, the evening light catching her tired face. Bills scattered across the table between them. David remembered the tremble in her voice. We can't keep doing this, she had whispered. I'll find more work, David had promised, even as pain shot through his injured back. I'll figure it out. Her eyes filled with tears. It's not just about money anymore. You're slipping away. I don't even know you anymore. He'd tried to argue, but deep down, he'd known she was right. The man he once was, provider, husband, father, had been crumbling, piece by piece. The sound of a suitcase zipper still echoed in his ears. The slam of the door. The silence afterward. David jolted awake, gasping. The shelter ceiling returned, cold and gray. His chest ached. His eyes burned. He sat up, gripping his head in his hands. "You're a fool," he muttered to himself. Thinking a woman like Sarah could see anything worth saving. Yet when dawn broke, he found himself walking the city streets, searching unconsciously for the place where they had parted ways. Sarah, meanwhile, sat at her kitchen table, coffee growing cold beside her laptop. The glow of the screen highlighted her tired features. She had meant to work, emails, reports, endless deadlines, but her thoughts kept circling back to David. There had been something raw in his eyes, something she hadn't seen in years, a man who had lost everything but hadn't lost the ability to care for others. And wasn't that what she herself had been missing? She had the job, the car, the house in a quiet neighborhood. But her days felt hollow. Her victories at work, meaningless. She had been searching for something real, and somehow, she had found it in the most unlikely place. Her phone buzzed with a message from her boss. Another meeting, another demand. She sighed, closing the laptop. For the first time in years, she ignored the message. Instead, she grabbed her coat and stepped into the crisp morning air. Their paths crossed again at the park near the shelter. David sat on a bench, hunched against the cold, staring at pigeons pecking at crumbs. His beard was scruffier today, his clothes more worn. But when Sarah approached, his eyes flickered with something fragile, recognition. "You came back," he said, almost in disbelief. "I said maybe was enough," she smiled gently. "And maybe turned into today." He looked away, jaw tight. "You shouldn't waste your time on me." "I don't see it as a waste," she said softly. "I see it as a choice. My choice." The words hung between them, heavy and true. They walked slowly along the park path. David kept his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, shoulders tense. Sarah waited, patient, until he finally spoke. "I keep hearing their voices," he admitted. "My boy, my wife. I see them in dreams. Then I wake up and," his voice cracked. "They're gone." Sarah's heart twisted. She wanted to say the perfect words, but instead, she simply listened. Sometimes, listening was the greatest gift. David stopped walking, staring at the frozen pond ahead. "Do you think people can come back from this? From losing everything?" Sarah stepped closer, her breath visible in the cold. "Yes. Not to who they were, maybe. But to someone new. Someone stronger." He gave a bitter laugh. "Stronger? I can barely stand some days." "Standing at all," she said firmly, "is strength." Her conviction startled him. He looked at her then, really looked, at the steadiness in her eyes, the quiet fire in her voice. Something inside him stirred, something buried long beneath shame and hunger. That evening, as Sarah drove home, she replayed his words in her mind. "Do you think people can come back from this?" And she realized, she wasn't just helping him. He was helping her. Reminding her that life wasn't about success or status. It was about connection. About finding light in places the world had abandoned. David, meanwhile, sat back on his bench long after Sarah left. The park grew darker, colder. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. Her presence lingered. Her belief in him, impossible, absurd, clung to him like a fragile thread of warmth. He whispered into the night, voice barely audible. Maybe I can come back." And though no one heard, the words felt like the first stone laid in the foundation of something new. The week dragged by with the kind of slow heaviness David had come to expect from life on the streets. Cold mornings, endless walking, the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. Yet this week felt different. For the first time in years, something new pulsed beneath the surface, anticipation. Sarah had said she would see him again. And unlike so many broken promises he'd heard in his life, he believed her. On Friday evening, she returned. This time, not by chance. She drove into the part of town most people avoided, her sleek silver sedan standing out against the cracked sidewalks and flickering street lamps. She parked near the shelter, scanning the area nervously, until she spotted him on his usual bench. He was huddled against the cold, jacket zipped to his chin. When he saw her, surprise flickered in his eyes, followed quickly by something else, relief. "You found me," he said quietly, as though afraid the moment might vanish if he spoke too loudly. "I told you I would." She smiled, holding out a paper bag. "Dinner. Something warm." He hesitated, then accepted it. The steam of chicken noodle soup and buttered bread drifted upward, filling the icy air with comfort. His hands trembled slightly as he held it. "Thank you," he murmured, almost embarrassed. They sat side by side, silence stretching between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Sarah watched him eat slowly, savoring each bite like it was a gift. Finally, she cleared her throat. "David. I've been thinking." He glanced at her, wary. "About what?" "About you. About how much potential you still have." "I see it. I can't stop seeing it." He laughed bitterly. "Potential? Look at me. I've got nothing." "Not true," she said firmly. "You have kindness. You have strength. You have experience most people can't even imagine. That matters." David shook his head, staring at the ground. "Words don't change anything." "No," Sarah admitted. "But actions can." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. His name, David Miller, was written neatly at the top. "I asked a friend for a favor," she explained. "She works at a community center across town. They're looking for someone to help with carpentry repairs, odd jobs, things like that. It's not glamorous. It's not high-paying. But it's honest work. A chance." David froze, the paper trembling in his hands. His eyes scanned the details: address, contact name, hours. "A job," he whispered, disbelief heavy in his tone. "A start," Sarah said softly. "If you want it." For a long moment, he couldn't speak. His chest tightened, breath shallow. A job. The one thing he had thought forever out of reach. But then fear surged, quick and sharp. "What if I fail?" he asked, voice cracking. "What if I show up and they see me for what I really am? Broken. Worthless. What if they regret giving me a chance?" Sarah leaned closer, her voice low but fierce. "Then you try again. And again. Because you are not worthless. Do you hear me? You are not." Her intensity startled him. No one had fought for him like this since Emily. He blinked rapidly, struggling against tears. "Why are you doing this?" he whispered. "Why me?" Sarah's gaze softened. "Because once, someone gave me a chance when I didn't think I deserved one. And it changed my life. Maybe it's time I do the same for someone else." The next day, David stood outside the community center, paper in hand. His stomach churned. His legs screamed to turn back. But Sarah's voice echoed in his head, "You are not worthless." He pushed open the door. Inside, the building bustled with activity. Children laughed in a nearby room, their voices high and bright. Volunteers moved tables, stacked chairs, organized supplies. The smell of fresh paint lingered in the air. A woman in her 50s approached, clipboard in hand. Her smile was warm but assessing. "You must be David," she said. "Sarah told me about you." His throat tightened. He nodded mutely. "We need help with the gymnasium floor," she explained. "Loose boards, some repairs. Think you can handle it?" He hesitated, then forced himself to meet her gaze. "Yes, ma'am. I can." Hours later, David knelt on the wooden floor, hammer in hand. Sawdust filled the air, familiar and comforting. His muscles ached, but in a way that felt good, purposeful. Children peeked through the doorway, whispering and giggling, curious about the man fixing their gym. For the first time in years, David felt something stir in his chest, pride. That evening, Sarah stopped by the center. She found him sitting on the bleachers, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked exhausted, but there was a glow in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "How was it?" she asked. He hesitated, then smiled, small, uncertain, but real. "It felt good. Like I still know how to do something right." Her own smile widened. "That's because you do." They sat in quiet companionship, the sounds of children playing echoing through the halls. For David, it was more than a job. It was proof that maybe, just maybe, his life wasn't over. For Sarah, it was confirmation of what she already believed, that sometimes, the smallest offer can change everything. That night, as David returned to the shelter, he unfolded the paper again, tracing his name written in neat ink. For years, he had been nobody. But now, for the first time in so long, he felt like somebody. And deep inside, hope, fragile but fierce, began to take root. For a few weeks, David's life carried a rhythm he hadn't known in years. Each morning he reported to the community center. He sanded down splintered wood, tightened loose hinges, and patched broken doors. The staff began greeting him warmly, the children waved, and the small paycheck, modest though it was, gave him dignity. He even started shaving again, his reflection in the shelter's cracked mirror slowly resembling the man he used to be. But life has a way of testing fragile hope. It began one rainy Tuesday. The sky was slate gray, the streets glistening with puddles. David had just finished replacing a section of the gymnasium wall when the supervisor, a man named Carl, approached. "You're doing good work," Carl said. "But, some of the staff noticed tools missing last night. We can't prove anything, but, the implication sliced deeper than any blade." "You think I stole them?" David asked, voice rough. Carl raised his hands quickly. "No one's saying that. But, people know your background. They talk." David's stomach dropped. Shame pressed against his chest. He wanted to shout that he hadn't touched a single tool that wasn't his to use. But he could see the suspicion in Carl's eyes, faint but present. It was the same old story, people saw the surface and assumed the worst. That evening, David walked back to the shelter in silence, rain soaking through his jacket. Sarah met him halfway, her umbrella shielding them both. "You're drenched," she said gently. "What happened?" He hesitated, then muttered, "They think I stole something." Her eyes widened. "What? That's ridiculous." "Doesn't matter," he said bitterly. "They'll never see me as more than a homeless guy who screwed up his life. No matter what I do." Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "David, listen to me. This is just a setback. Don't let it undo everything you've built." But the doubt gnawed at him, louder than her reassurance. The next day, things worsened. A young volunteer discovered a missing wallet in the staff lounge. Whispers spread quickly. David felt the stares when he entered the room. He overheard one woman mutter under her breath, "Of course it was him." Heat rushed to his face. His fists clenched. Finally, he snapped. "You think I did it?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "Go ahead. Blame the guy with nothing. That's easy, isn't it?" The room fell silent. Carl stepped forward, his expression uneasy. "David, calm down." "No," David said, his voice breaking. "You'll never believe me. No one ever does." He stormed out, leaving a stunned silence behind him. That night, alone on his bench, the familiar voice of despair crept back in. "You don't belong. You'll never escape this. People like you don't get second chances. For the first time since Sarah found him, he felt the weight of hopelessness threaten to crush him. His hands shook as he buried his face in them. Memories of Emily surfaced, the warmth of their tiny living room, the way she used to laugh at his corny jokes, the night he held her as her breathing grew shallow. He had promised her he'd keep living, keep trying. But what if he was failing her even now? The following day, David didn't show up at the center. Or the next. Sarah drove to the shelter but found his bed empty. Panic gnawed at her. She searched the streets, calling his name through alleys and under bridges. Finally, she spotted him behind a shuttered diner, hunched against the wall, eyes bloodshot. "David," she whispered, kneeling beside him. He didn't look up. "They think I'm a thief," he murmured. "They're right to. Maybe that's all I'll ever be." Sarah's throat tightened. "You didn't steal anything. I know you. I know you." He shook his head. "Doesn't matter. I can't fight the world. I'm tired, Sarah." Her chest ached at the sight of him, the man who had begun to rise, now sinking again. She wanted to pull him up, to shake him, to remind him of the child he had fed, of the kindness that still lived in him. Instead, she simply sat beside him in the rain-soaked alley, her voice trembling but steady. "Then let me fight with you. Don't give up on yourself. Don't give up on the man I see." The next morning, an unexpected development changed everything. Carl arrived at the shelter, clutching a wallet. "We found it," he said, sheepish. It had slipped behind a filing cabinet. David didn't take it. The news spread quickly. Whispers turned into apologies. But David wasn't there to hear it. That evening, Sarah found him again, this time at the park where it had all begun, the same bench where he had given his last piece of bread. She approached quietly, sitting beside him. "They found the wallet," she said softly. "You were innocent. Just like you said." David turned his face toward her, tears shimmering in his tired eyes. "But it still hurt," he whispered. "The looks, the words, it felt like proof that I don't belong anywhere." Sarah swallowed hard. "Then make your own place. Not for them. For you. For Emily. For the child you saved. For the man you are, not the one they think you are." He stared at her, broken yet listening. And in that fragile moment, something shifted, a reminder that even in setbacks, hope could still survive. The next week unfolded with a different kind of stillness. David hadn't returned to the community center yet. Though Carl and the others had cleared his name, he couldn't shake the bruise left by suspicion. The air itself felt heavy, the kind of weight that clung to a man's spirit long after the storm had passed. But then, something unexpected began to stir. It started with a letter. One afternoon, Sarah drove to the park bench, carrying a paper envelope she had picked up at the community center. Inside was a crayon drawing from a child. It showed a stick figure man handing a piece of bread to a smaller stick figure child. The words, written in uneven letters, said, "Thank you, Mr. You saved me." Sarah found David on the bench, staring at the lake where geese glided quietly. She handed him the letter. He unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the childish strokes. His breath caught. The drawing was simple, yet it hit harder than any accusation ever could. For the first time in days, David smiled faintly, though his eyes watered. "The boy," he whispered. "He remembered." Sarah nodded. He did more than remember. That moment changed him. And maybe it's supposed to change you too. That night, David couldn't sleep. He lay awake in the shelter, staring at the ceiling, the crayon drawing clutched in his hand. His thoughts drifted back to Emily, her laughter, her resilience through cancer, the way she had always believed in the goodness of people. He whispered into the dark, "Emily, am I still the man you believed in?" For the first time, he felt as though she answered, not in words, but in the warmth that settled in his chest. A quiet reminder, you're more than your mistakes. You're still capable of love, of purpose. The following morning, David returned to the community center. The staff greeted him with hesitant smiles, a mix of apology and relief. Carl pulled him aside. "David, I owe you an apology," he said, voice firm. "We were wrong to doubt you. I see now, you're not just helping us fix walls. You're teaching us something about strength." David blinked, surprised. He had expected awkwardness, maybe pity. But not respect. For the first time in years, he felt seen. Later that week, Sarah convinced David to attend a small gathering at the local church hall. It was a community gratitude night, where residents shared stories of kindness. At first, David sat in the back, shoulders hunched, uneasy under the fluorescent lights. Then a familiar face stepped onto the stage, the little boy he had fed that night in the park, now standing with his mother. The boy clutched the microphone nervously, then pointed toward David in the crowd. "That's him," the boy said shyly. "He gave me food when I was hungry. He didn't even know me. He saved me." The hall fell silent. All eyes turned toward David. His heart pounded in his chest. Shame and pride warred inside him, shame for the years he had spent broken, pride that one small act had meant so much. The boy's mother spoke next, tears in her eyes. "I had lost my job that month. We had nothing left. That night, I prayed for a miracle, and God sent us one. This man didn't just give my son bread. He gave me hope." The audience erupted in applause. David lowered his head, tears streaming freely. It felt overwhelming, the acknowledgement, the gratitude, the sudden realization that his life, even in its darkest season, had not been meaningless. After the gathering, people approached him one by one. A teacher thanked him for reminding her students about kindness. A business owner offered him odd jobs. The pastor shook his hand firmly, saying, "Sometimes the smallest acts echo the loudest in heaven." David felt something shift inside him, a revelation not born of thunder or fire, but of gentle, undeniable truth: he mattered. Not because of titles or wealth, not because of who he used to be, but because of what he chose to do in moments of compassion. That night, back at the park, David sat again on the old bench. The stars were sharp against the velvet sky. Sarah sat beside him, quiet but present. "You know," David said softly, "for years I thought my life ended when Emily died. That everything afterward was just waiting. But I see it now. That bread wasn't the last thing I had to give. It was the first step back." Sarah smiled, her eyes glistening. "That's the revelation, David. You didn't lose your purpose. You just forgot it for a while." He nodded, voice trembling. "I thought I was invisible. But, turns out I was part of something bigger all along." As the night deepened, a peace settled over him, not the fragile kind that disappears with the dawn, but the kind that roots itself in truth. The revelation was clear: even in brokenness, he had power. Power to change someone's life with a simple act. Power to rewrite his own story. Power to honor Emily's memory not with grief, but with kindness. And for the first time in years, David dared to imagine a future not defined by loss, but by love. The days that followed the church gathering marked the beginning of something David never thought possible, not just acceptance, but rebirth. For the first time in years, he walked through town without shrinking into shadows. People recognized him now, not as the homeless man by the park, but as the man who gave bread when he had nothing else. A chance at work one morning, Carl called David into his office at the community center. "I've been thinking," Carl said, leaning across the desk. "We've got some funding coming in for a new outreach program. We need someone who understands what it means to struggle, someone the people can trust. I want you on board, David." Not just as a volunteer. As part of the staff. David blinked, stunned. For so long, doors had been slammed in his face. Now one was opening, wide. But... Carl, he stammered. I don't even have a place of my own. I'm not sure I'm qualified. Carl smiled gently. You're more qualified than most. You've lived it. You can connect with people no degree can teach. That's what this program needs. Tears pricked David's eyes. For years, he had begged for scraps of dignity. Now, he was being offered responsibility, trust, and a salary. It felt like oxygen rushing into lungs long starved of air. Building a new life with the modest paycheck, David rented a small room above a diner. It wasn't much, a creaky bed, one window that overlooked Main Street, the smell of bacon and coffee drifting up each morning, but it was his. The first night he lay on that bed, he stared at the ceiling, whispering, "Emily, I'm home." Healing old wounds. The transformation wasn't just material. It was emotional. One afternoon, Sarah encouraged David to attend a grief support group at the hospital. At first, he resisted. Facing strangers, speaking about Emily, it felt unbearable. But when his turn came, David surprised himself. He spoke about love, about loss, about the guilt of surviving when the person you loved most didn't. And then he spoke about the bread. About the boy. About how a single act of giving had reignited something in him. When he finished, the room was silent, not with judgment, but with understanding. A woman reached out, squeezing his hand. "You gave us hope tonight," she whispered. David walked out lighter than he had in years. He realized healing wasn't about forgetting Emily, but about carrying her memory forward into something good. Small acts, big ripples. David's work at the outreach program quickly grew into more than a job. He visited shelters, speaking with men who sat where he once had. He walked the streets, carrying sandwiches for anyone hungry. He listened, really listened, to stories of broken marriages, addiction, lost jobs. He didn't offer pity. He offered presence. And the men responded, because he wasn't preaching from above, he was standing beside them, proof that redemption was possible. One evening, a young man approached him outside the shelter, trembling. "Mr. David, I was going to end my life tonight. But then I remembered your story, about how you thought it was over, and it wasn't. You gave me a reason to wait one more day." David's throat tightened. He put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's all any of us can do, son. One more day. And then another." In that moment, David realized the ripples of his transformation were spreading wider than he ever imagined. Confronting the past. But transformation is never complete without facing the shadows. One Sunday afternoon, David found himself standing outside a large brick house on the edge of town. It was his brother Mark's house. They hadn't spoken in over a decade. Mark had blamed David for being absent when their mother passed. David had blamed Mark for not helping when Emily was sick. Pride had built walls higher than either man could climb. Now, David stood at the door, heart pounding. He knocked. Mark opened it, stunned into silence. His hair was grayer, his frame heavier, but the anger in his eyes had softened. "David?" he asked quietly. David swallowed hard. "It's me. I don't have excuses, Mark. I just came to say I'm sorry. For everything." The silence stretched. Then, slowly, Mark stepped aside. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table, awkward at first, then spilling years of grief and resentment. By the time the sun set, there were tears, forgiveness, and something that felt like the start of brotherhood again. For David, it was the final piece, the proof that transformation wasn't just about his own healing, but about mending what had been broken around him. The community's embrace. Months later, the community center hosted a celebration for the outreach program's success. People gathered in the hall, walls decorated with photos of families who had been helped, children who had found shelter, men who had found jobs. Carl took the microphone. This program wouldn't exist without one man's courage. A man who turned his lowest moment into hope for others. A man who reminded us that one act of kindness can change a whole town. He gestured to David. The applause was thunderous. Sarah clapped hardest, her eyes shining with pride. David stepped onto the stage, gripping the mic with trembling hands. I used to think my life ended the day I lost Emily. But I see now, that was just the beginning of a different story. We all fall. We all break. But we're not defined by our worst moments. We're defined by what we do after. And sometimes, all it takes is giving your last piece of bread. The crowd rose to their feet in a standing ovation. David bowed his head, tears slipping down his face. He wasn't invisible anymore. He was alive. He was part of something larger. He was transformed. It was late autumn. The leaves had turned gold and red, swirling across the streets of the small town. But the beauty of the season was interrupted one night by a violent storm, heavy rain pounding against windows, thunder rattling rooftops. David, now living above the diner and working at the outreach program, was locking up when he heard the sound of someone crying under the awning by the community center. He stepped closer. A boy, shivering, soaked to the bone, sat clutching a thin backpack. His clothes were ragged, his shoes caked with mud. David knelt. "Son, what are you doing out here? You'll catch your death in this weather." The boy flinched, eyes wide with fear. "Please, don't call the cops. I just need somewhere to stay. Just for tonight." Something about those eyes struck David, a haunting familiarity. And then it hit him. This was the same boy. The same hungry child he had given his last bread to months ago. Recognition. The boy recognized him too. His face softened. "It's you, the man from the park." David felt his throat tighten. Fate had brought them together again, in the middle of a storm. "Come inside," David said gently. "No questions, no judgment. Just warmth." He guided the boy into the center, wrapped him in a blanket, and set a cup of hot cocoa before him. The boy drank greedily, tears streaming down his face. "My name's Ethan," he whispered. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. I didn't know where else to go." Ethan's story. As the storm raged outside, Ethan began to share his story. His mother had passed away from illness the year before. His father, broken by grief, turned to drinking and became abusive. One night, after a fight, Ethan had run away, choosing the streets over violence at home. He had wandered from town to town, hungry, tired, invisible. That day in the park, Ethan said softly, "I hadn't eaten for 2 days. I thought, maybe nobody cared if I disappeared. And then you gave me bread. You looked at me like I mattered." David's chest ached. He reached across the table, placing a steady hand on Ethan's. "You do matter. You've always mattered. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." A test of grace. The next morning, David called Sarah and Carl. "This boy needs help. He can't go back home, not now. But he deserves a chance." Sarah met Ethan and instantly connected with him, her heart drawn to his quiet resilience. Carl spoke with social services, but because Ethan was nearly 16, the system was complicated. "They'll place him in temporary foster care," Carl explained. "But it's never certain where he'll end up." David looked at Ethan, trembling at the thought of being shuffled around again. In that moment, David knew what he had to do. "I'll take him," David said firmly. "I'll be responsible." Carl and Sarah exchanged stunned glances. "David, that's a huge step." "Are you sure?" David nodded. "Emily and I never had children. But I think, maybe this is why I'm still here. Maybe this is what all of it was leading to. A father's heart. The process wasn't easy. There were forms, background checks, interviews. But David, once a man who had nothing, now stood with a steady job, a room of his own, and a community vouching for him. Weeks later, standing in front of a county judge, David listened as the decision was made: Ethan would be placed in his guardianship. When the gavel struck, Ethan's eyes filled with tears. David pulled him close, whispering, "You're not alone anymore, son. You're home." For David, it was the moment everything came full circle. He had given away his last bread, never imagining it would return to him as family. The power of grace. Life shifted once more. David moved to a slightly bigger apartment, 2 small bedrooms, one for him, one for Ethan. He cooked simple meals: eggs, pancakes, chili. Ethan, unused to stability, often woke in the night, afraid it would all vanish. David would sit with him, reminding him gently, "You're safe now. You're wanted." At school, Ethan struggled at first. Bullies whispered about the foster kid. But when David came to a parent-teacher meeting, shoulders squared, head held high, Ethan saw something he had never known before: a father figure who stood up for him. "I believe in this boy," David told the teachers. "He's going to make it. He just needs a chance." And slowly, Ethan began to thrive. Full circle at the park one sunny afternoon, nearly a year after their first meeting, David and Ethan walked together through the same park where their lives had first intersected. The benches were the same, the air filled with laughter and birdsong. Ethan pointed to the spot where David had given him the bread. "Right there. That's where everything changed." David smiled. "No, Ethan. That's where we changed. Both of us." They sat side by side on the bench, watching children play. A little girl nearby dropped her ice cream, beginning to cry. Without hesitation, Ethan jumped up, bought her another cone from the vendor, and handed it to her with a smile. The girl's face lit up, her tears forgotten. David's chest swelled with pride. The cycle of grace had begun again, passed from one hand to another, from one act of kindness to the next. The moral peak that evening, David wrote in his journal: "Grace is not something we earn. It's something we give. I gave bread, and in return, God gave me a son. My life didn't change because I was rescued. It changed because I chose to give, even when I had nothing. That choice came back to me 100-fold." The story that had started with despair had now reached its climax, not with riches, not with fame, but with family, love, and grace that healed 2 broken souls. A new beginning. David's life was no longer defined by what he had lost, but by what he had found. Each morning, he rose early, brewed coffee, and packed lunches for himself and Ethan. They ate breakfast together at the little kitchen table, sunlight spilling through the blinds, laughter slowly becoming a normal part of their days. Ethan was growing tall, his once hollow cheeks now full of life. He joined the school soccer team, bringing home grass-stained uniforms and wide grins. For every game, David sat proudly in the bleachers, cheering the loudest. He had once been the man everyone avoided on the streets. Now, he was the man everyone admired in the community, not for wealth or success, but for the way he lived out grace. Small ripples at the diner where David still worked part-time, customers would often ask, "How's your boy doing?" David's eyes would shine as he answered, "Better every day. He's got a good heart." And indeed, Ethan had a good heart. The boy who had once been invisible now became a beacon for others. He volunteered at the community center, tutoring younger kids in math and reading. He remembered too well what it felt like to be overlooked. One evening, Sarah watched Ethan helping a struggling second grader with spelling words. She whispered to David, "You gave him a home. And now, he's giving others hope. That's legacy, David. That's what Emily would be proud of." David's eyes grew moist. He often thought of Emily in quiet moments, imagining her smile, imagining how she might have welcomed Ethan with open arms. Though she was gone, her spirit lived on through every act of kindness he carried forward. Ethan's milestone years later, Ethan stood tall in a cap and gown at his high school graduation. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as students prepared to walk across the stage. Parents clapped and waved from the crowd. David sat in the front row, heart pounding. He remembered the boy shivering in the storm, clutching a backpack, afraid of being forgotten. And now here he was, strong, confident, smiling as his name was called. "Ethan Miller," the announcer said. Ethan crossed the stage, shaking hands with the principal. He spotted David in the crowd and lifted his diploma high, pride radiating from his face. After the ceremony, Ethan rushed into David's arms. "We did it," he whispered. "No, son," David said softly, holding him close. "You did it. I just walked beside you." The choice to give back. Ethan didn't forget where he had come from. When he received a scholarship to a local college, he chose to study social work, determined to help children who were growing up in the shadows like he once did. "I want to make sure no kid feels invisible the way I did," Ethan explained. "If one person hadn't cared, I wouldn't be here. I want to be that person for someone else." David's heart swelled with pride. The bread he had once given had multiplied into something far greater, a calling, a mission, a life dedicated to lifting others. Full circle moments on quiet evenings, David and Ethan still returned to the park, the place where their story began. They would sit on the same bench, watching the world go by. One evening, a small boy with messy hair approached them, holding out a crumpled drawing. "Do you like it?" he asked shyly. Ethan bent down, admiring the picture of a bright sun and stick figures holding hands. "It's perfect," he said warmly. "Thank you for sharing it." As the child ran back to his mother, David smiled. "Do you see? That's how it begins. With a smile, a word, a gift. Small things, Ethan. They grow." Ethan nodded. "Just like you taught me." David's reflection in his later years, David often sat at his desk, pen in hand, writing reflections in his worn journal. He wrote about pain, about hunger, about despair. But more importantly, he wrote about the miracle of one choice, the day he gave away his bread, not knowing it would change the course of his life. He wrote about Sarah and Carl, whose compassion became a lifeline. About Ethan, who became his son. About Emily, whose memory guided him through every act of grace. "Life isn't measured by what we keep," David wrote in one entry, "but by what we give. In giving, we find purpose. In grace, we find home." The final gift years later, as David's hair turned silver and his steps slowed, Ethan remained faithfully by his side. He graduated college, began working with children in foster care, and eventually started his own family. At David's retirement gathering at the diner, the community filled the room, neighbors, students, colleagues, all whose lives he had touched. Carl raised a toast. To David, a man who turned his pain into purpose, his sorrow into love, and his bread into a legacy. The crowd cheered, and David, eyes brimming with tears, looked at Ethan. "None of it would have mattered without you, son. You were my second chance." A legacy that lives on. When David eventually passed away peacefully in his sleep, the town mourned deeply. Yet, his story didn't end there. Ethan continued the work they had started together, founding a program for homeless youth, naming it Emily's Bread, in honor of the woman David had loved and the act of kindness that had begun it all. Every week, volunteers handed out meals, shelter, and encouragement to children who felt forgotten. On the wall of the center hung a framed picture of David, smiling, with the words, "One act of grace can change everything." And so, the legacy continued. Closing scene years later, Ethan stood with his own daughter in the same park, pointing to the old bench. "That's where a stranger once saved my life," he told her. His daughter, wide-eyed, asked, "How?" Ethan knelt, smiling. With bread. Just bread. But it wasn't really about the bread. It was about love. About believing someone mattered. The little girl thought for a moment, then squeezed her father's hand. Can we do that too, Daddy? Can we help people? Ethan's eyes filled with tears. Yes, sweetheart. That's exactly what we'll do. And just like that, the cycle of grace continued, one act of kindness passed from one generation to the next, like a flame that could never be extinguished.